Hello everybody. So some exciting news. I just passed 5,000 subscribers on my YouTube channel, which is very exciting for me. It's taken me years to get here, so awesome. I'm glad so many people are enjoying folklore-based fairy videos. It's sort of a very niche subject, so I'm glad there's so many of you out there that like this topic. I also found out recently that abstract I had submitted for a book coming out through an academic publisher focusing on green women was accepted. My particular article is going to be about green and fairies, sort of how fairies and the color green are intertwined across various beliefs. So that sort of inspired me today to do this video where I'm going to talk a little about different colors that are specifically associated with fairies and kind of the way that they're associated with fairies, which I hope everyone will find interesting and or entertaining. So I do want to say, first of all, that we have a lot of evidence that connects fairies to various specific colors. However, it's a little unclear in all of these sources, or most of these sources, whether they're talking about the color clothing that the fairies are wearing or the color of the fairies' hair and skin. In some cases, the context kind of supports it being the clothing. In other cases, the context supports it being the skin or hair. And in most of the cases, there isn't enough context to support either. We're just sort of given a description and you can imagine it whichever direction you want to imagine it in. So I want to say that first before I get into all these colors, so you can just keep in mind throughout the rest of the video if I'm talking about, these fairies were said to be associated with this color, unless I get very specific and give an example and explain how it applies in that example, just assume that it was given in a vague way in the original source material, because that is usually the case. And this is additionally confusing because in a lot of cultures and languages, Irish and Scottish included, when they say like a brown man, they don't mean skin color, they mean hair. So that is sort of something that contributes to this confusion. There are, of course, terms in Irish for people who have various skin colors all across the options. But when you see references in those languages to a person being brown or black or red, they're generally referring to hair color. And that just adds a layer of extra difficulty when sort of going through all of this source material to try to be sure we're understanding what they actually mean. And that was a bit of a long introduction, but I just want to be clear when I talk about colors that they're colors that are associated with fairies in various ways, usually physical descriptions, but we're not 100% sure how those physical descriptions work, if that makes sense to everyone. So, as I mentioned, the article that I'm going to be writing specifically focuses on the color green. We might as well just start there. Why not? Green is probably the single color that is the most associated with fairies. And this is across a range of Western European fairy beliefs. Particularly in the border areas of northern England and then in Scotland, was something that was seen to be unlucky for human women to wear because it was thought to be the fairies' particular color. We have reference in the Ballad of Alice Brand to the green as being the fairies' fatal green. And in that particular ballad, the elf king, the fairy king of that forest, is angry because there's a human in the forest who is wearing green. And that is the fairies' particular color. In the ballad, don't want humans wearing that color. So we see that for one example. We often see the fairy queen in ballad material, again, described wearing green dress, usually green velvet. So sort of, imagine it being very aristocratic, appropriate for a queen, green velvet. But again, it's that color green kind of showing up again. There is a story that comes from England of the Green Children, for anyone who's already familiar with that. For those of you who aren't, this was in, I believe, the 12th century in a town called Woolpit, where these two children were found sort of at the edges of the town, and they were literally physically green. Their skin was green. And they were taken into the town. They initially did not speak a language anyone understood, and they didn't seem to understand the version of English that was around at the time. They eventually, I should back that up, skipping ahead a little bit. They refused to eat food until they saw someone coming in with broad beans out of the field. They did eat those. It was a boy and a girl. The boy, unfortunately, did not survive. The girl eventually learned English and sort of adapted and also stopped being green. Her skin became a normal human skin tone, however you want to interpret that in context. So it's interesting because in this particular case, they were clearly described as having green skin. And there have been theories to try to explain that, outside of fairy belief, whether they might have had an illness or some sort of poisoning happening. There are certain things that can cause the complexion to take on sort of a greenish tinge. They were described in the two sources that reported about them at the time as having skin that was leek green, L-E-E-K, the plant, leek green. So if that helps with a little bit of context for imagining how these children would have looked. But there is a pretty widespread belief that these were fairies, and in part because of this connection with the color green. It's just something we find across a wide range of stories. Fairies and the color green, intrinsically connected, but also generally fairies that have the color green about them, or wearing green, or are physically green, are sort of the neutral range of fairies, I guess we could say. They might be dangerous, they might be helpful. The only thing the color says about them is that they're associated with or connected to fairies because it's seen as a specifically fairy color. That is not true, however, when we look at the color red. So red is another color we often find associated with fairies. Certain types of fairy hounds are supposed to have red ears and red eyes. We see accounts in some of the Irish myths of animals that are coming out of the Sidhe, out of the fairy mounds. Again, either being red or having red ears is a pretty common one. So we see these associations with this color, and there's sort of two directions that they go in. In the older stories, the older myths and the older folklore, fairies who have the red on them or around them are generally more dangerous. Not always, but generally. They are beings that either are associated with outright danger to humans or being omens of danger. So like the banshee, for example, in some lore is said to have red shoes, often a white dress, but red shoes. And this is sort of an indication that she has this connection to death. That is a pretty clear connection to make. Red is the color of blood. Blood, when it's not in your body, is generally not a good sign for you, and hence the connection to death. So we see this in stories where people are encountering fairies that are wearing red or have red hair or probably have red going on about them, that these tend to be usually the more dangerous sorts of beings that a person can potentially encounter. This is not a hard and fast rule. It's just the general association with that color tends to be the more dangerous beings. The red cap also comes to mind. This is another fairy that we find in the border areas, northern England and southern Scotland, said to haunt ruins. His hat is red because he dyes it in fresh human blood. Again, pretty clear to make the connection with dangerous right there. So when we look at green, kind of more neutral, it doesn't really tell us whether the fairy in question is going to be helpful or dangerous. When we look at red, however, that usually is not a particularly good sign. You would much rather encounter a fairy dressed in green or that is green, rather than one that is associated with the color red. So another main color, which I kind of just touched on a little bit when I talked about the banshee, is white. White is also associated with death, for the record, in older Irish stories. but white is a color that is very strongly associated with the other world, mostly in a neutral way, leaning slightly into a more positive way, surprisingly, because I just said it's connected to death, but here we are. I will say, and this is kind of an important detail, you will sometimes run across stories or ballads or material that talks about fairies being white. Now, again, in many cases, this is talking about what they're wearing. They're saying they're wearing white. However, when it is talking about skin color, they're not talking about human skin color that we would call white, which clearly is not actually white. When we see fairies being described as having white skin, they mean that very literally. When you look at the prose version of the Ballad of True Thomas, the prose version is called Thomas of Ercheldoune. When we look at that story, there's a point in that where he describes sort of all these fairy beings that he's encountering when the fairy queen takes him into the other world. And he describes one of them in particular as being white as whale's bone. So when we see fairies in these stories described as being white, they mean literally white, not any kind of human skin tone. That has nothing to do with it. This is someone who would stand out in a human crowd because they are actually literally the color white. Also, probably important to note that the word elf comes from the older word alb, which, if you go all the way back into the proto-languages, relates to the word white or shining. But again, we're not talking about white in a human context. We're talking about like light reflecting off of water, white, bright, shining, that kind of a color. So again, associating the color white with these beings. Sometimes it's how they're physically described. Sometimes it's the clothing that they're wearing. Isabel Gaudy, in talking about her encounters with the fairies, she was a witch who was accused in 17th century, I believe, Scotland, and put on trial. She was one of the very few who, according to the stories, freely confessed, and confessed in great detail about all of her experiences and fairy encounters. I will say, even though the material says she confessed freely, there's no way for us to actually know that. And at the very least, there likely was some sleep deprivation and possibly food deprivation going on. So you always want to take accounts from the Scottish witchcraft trials with that in mind, that no matter what people are saying, there was some sort of duress involved. However, that being said, she describes the king of fairy as a handsome man wearing white, dressed in white. And we do also have some accounts across various stories of the fairy queen being seen wearing white. The Welsh Cwnanwn, the Welsh fairy hounds, otherworldly hounds, are said to be white with red ears. We've heard various stories across the folklore of white deer being considered a guide or an omen of the other world. So the color white, kind of like the color green, is a little more neutral, but leans a bit into positive. Generally speaking, fairies that are said to wear white or are described as white, literally white, tend to be on the more positive end of neutral, if that makes sense to everyone. We're never going to have really fairies that are 100% like definitely 100% positive or definitely 100% negative. There's always a lot of, pun intended, gray areas going on. Speaking of gray, I guess I'll use that as a segue to our next color. Gray is associated with fairies, but most particularly in Orkney. The trows there, and I apologize if I'm not pronouncing trows correctly. There is a big argument I've seen where some people pronounce it trow and some people pronounce it tro. I think tro is actually probably the correct because it's a dialectic corruption of the word troll, but I have it in my head as trow, so that is just how I tend to automatically say it. But trow or tro, whichever one it is, in the Orkney Isles are said to be gray. Again, in some stories this seems to be the clothing that they're wearing. However, in other stories this does seem to be the color of their skin, is some shade of gray. They are, in some euphemisms, referred to as the gray neighbors or the gray folk. So very strongly associated with them. Trows are very particular folklore from the Orkney Isles. They are mostly not super negative. They will sometimes steal people. They can cause people problems, but for the most part, they sort of exist as this separate community in relation to or connection to the human community. So we can kind of say, I guess, gray is also sort of a neutral, doesn't tell us much kind of color. So we have green, red, white, gray. We do have some examples of the color black being connected with fairies. Again, this could be hair color, this could be what they're wearing. If it is skin color, please take that in the same context as the white. This would not be what we would refer to as a human skin tone black. This would be literally the color black. That just seems to be how these descriptions work. This color is an interesting one because in some of the source material it's presented without any sort of bias, and we just see this description being applied to certain types of fairy beings. However, there is a huge amount of bias in all of the Western European sources where the color white is generally seen as a positive thing and the color black is seen as negative or dangerous. And this definitely does impact fairy beliefs and how certain stories are relayed, or sort of the layers of context that have been applied to them because of this. So when we see fairies referred to as black, again, whether it's the clothing that they're wearing or their hair color or what have you, often they are more directly associated with negativity or negative actions, danger to humans. I will say, sort of tangential to fairies, but maybe worth mentioning here, that Jacob Grimm, in his Teutonic mythology, which he wrote in the 19th century, he claims that there's three groups of elves. We have the Losafar, the white elves. Again, picture shining white. We have the Dochafar, who are the dusky elves, and are kind of associated with burial mounds and the human dead. And then we have the Dochafar. The Dochafar are the black elves. Oh, I just messed that up. Dochafar are gray elves. There we go. The Svartalfar are the black elves. Svart is literally the color black, and then Alfar elves. When we look at the older material, the older Icelandic material, there isn't really any moral connection to most of this. The Svartalfar are generally thought to be dwarves, and the Losafar are what we would call elves today in more modern culture. So they're just two groups that are closely related types of beings. When we look at the German material, which is what Grimm was referencing, we also see a lot of that going on. We have dwarves and elves who are kind of closely related species, I guess we could say. However, Grimm was pretty quick to kind of apply a very sort of Christian lens to this, white good, black bad. So he describes the Losafar as like the good elves, and the Svartalfar as the demonic elves, the bad elves. It's important to understand that because this is, of course, layers of belief we've now had for hundreds of years, but it's also important to understand it within that context and that lens of these imposed moral implications with the colors. In most of the stories, there really isn't a moral implication. Fairies in general, you don't really have a lot of moral implications with them. They are sort of amoral, immoral beings by nature. But when we see some particular sources coming in, they do try to differentiate them into like the good ones and the bad ones based on color. Just be very cautious about leaning too much into that. It's something that a lot of people are sort of enculturated with in Western culture, but it's very problematic in a bunch of different ways. So what we really have is just references to black elves or black fairies as beings who do exist. We know we have stories of them. In some stories, they seem to be acting in more malicious ways. In other stories, they are much more neutral in description and action. So I would really place the black kind of along the lines of maybe in between the green and the red on the scale of how concerned should you be if you see a fairy in this color or of this color. They're not necessarily malicious, but you would want to be maybe cautious. And I will say, to give you sort of an example of how complicated all of this can be, when we look at Kelpie stories, Kelpies are a type of fairy that can take the form of a horse or take the form of a human. They are known for drowning and eating humans. That's sort of their favorite mealtime pastime, not enjoyed as much by the humans. But Kelpies are usually described in Scottish material as either white horses or black horses. So here we can kind of see the color white, which in most stories, as I mentioned, is seen as more neutral, leaning into positive, is dangerous in this context. And the color black is clearly dangerous in this context. So just important to keep in mind, I guess, that everything I'm saying here is more of a guideline than a hard and fast rule. Any color can appear anywhere on this spectrum. We do also have a few references to blue fairies. These are mostly from England. And they generally appear more when people are just observing fairies doing whatever fairies happen to be doing, dancing or processing or, parading or whatever they happen to be observed doing. We hear some accounts of them being described wearing blue. There was one particular type of fairy in England that was strongly associated with the color blue and just sort of falls into that general fairy range of sometimes helpful, sometimes harmful, not outright malicious, but you definitely don't want to make him mad, that kind of a thing. So the color blue doesn't have any particularly strong associations with it. We, outside of that, have some much less common accounts of yellow fairies and talking about the clothing in particular. In Scotland, fairies were known to wear plaids, mostly because they were known to dress in ways similar to the humans around them. So that would have been plaids. There's no particular strong color associations with the plaids. It's not like they had there's no fairy plaid, for anyone who's familiar with plaids in Scotland. But we do have references to them in that color, appearing in that color. Yellow fairies are kind of more obscure. Again, they tend to show up more in cases where the fairies are being listed in different groups by color. So someone might see like a group of blue fairies and a group of yellow fairies and a group of red fairies as part of a fairy procession. And the yellow, we don't really have enough context for it to fit it into our discussion today. I do just want to mention it. So these are pretty much the main colors that fairies are associated with across mythology and folklore. The green, red, and white are by far the most common colors associated with them. And again, as I said, we kind of get this weird range of like white is neutral towards positive, green is neutral, general fairy color, and then red is neutral into negative. That's sort of the scale of fairy color associations. This is all material, by the way, from the years that I have studied fairies and have looked into these subjects. I have written articles before about fairies and color associations, kind of touching on everything I've been saying in this whole video. I'm excited to get into a real in-depth look at the color green with fairies because it is just that stereotypical fairy color. Green is also associated with death, now that I'm thinking of it as we get to the end of the video. So maybe all the fairy colors, one way or another, have death associations. It's probably a statement on the connection between fairies and the human dead or death. I should do a whole separate video about that, though. I'm not going to go off on a tangent about it now. But that covers kind of all of the basics of fairy and color associations. I hope people found this interesting. It's a subject that I find really interesting, and I'm always interested in learning more about. I don't think we have, in the 21st century, any sort of clearly established beliefs around this the way that we do in the older material, although I do think people continue to associate green with fairies pretty strongly. So, that's my video for today. Happy 5,000 subscribers to my channel once again. Yay! And excited to be digging into this article. I've been not making videos as much because I have been writing quite a bit. I kind of took on a lot with my publisher. I have multiple books coming out and in the works, and it's been a lot. And obviously also getting out there writing articles occasionally. So I hope everyone liked this. I'm sorry for the 4-month hiatus. It was not intentional. And I know I say this every single video I make and then I don't do it, but I really am going to try to start doing a video at least once a month to add to this channel, to help people who are interested in the more folklore-based fairy beliefs sort of have that grounded understanding of these beings and these ideas through that lens. So I will see everyone next time.